You lost, boy. The word slapped the back of my neck like heat, loud enough to echo, soft enough to sting. I hadn't moved. I was still standing behind the defense table, file in hand, suit pressed, badge clipped neatly to my shirt pocket. But every eye in the courtroom turned toward me, slowly, like I'd pulled a weapon instead of a stapled brief. I didn't answer. Not right away. Judge Halbrook leaned forward from the bench. Older white man, thick glasses, pale pink scalp, catching the sunlight through the blinds. I asked you a question. You in the wrong courtroom, son. Trials are over there, he said, gesturing toward the row of seats where detained men in jumpsuits were shackled to benches. My mouth didn't move, but inside, something ancient cracked. Open, like a door I hadn't touched in years. Behind me I could hear muffled scoffs, probably from the bailiff, maybe even a snort from my own classmate Liam, who had walked in with me, but was now pretending like we hadn't shared a ride from campus. I had been warned this could happen. My advisor had said, some of these backwater courthouses still breathe Jim Crow dust. Just do your job and keep your tie straight, but nothing prepares you for it until it happens to you. I set the folder on the table, took one breath, then turned around slowly, just like Granddad once did. 2 weeks ago I found the VHS tape in a plastic shoebox in Mama's basement. Malik, put that down, she'd said, dusting off an old blanket. That's your grandfather's foolishness, always recording himself like somebody was gonna listen. But I did listen. I listened to that creaky footage of Granddad's suit, faded at the shoulder, standing before this same judge's father in the same courthouse. I watched him argue a desegregation case with nothing but a ballpoint pen and nerves made of steel. His voice didn't waver. His eyes never dropped. You address this court with respect, the tape crackled. I am respecting it, Granddad had replied with truth. Now in 2025 I took one step forward, just like he had. I'm Malik J. Henderson, Your Honor, I said clearly. Third-year legal fellow interning under Ms. Rubin, licensed defense attorney of record. I'm here to submit the motion to suppress for the Martin case. The courtroom was quiet enough to hear the air vents whir. Judge Halbrook blinked. Like I'd spoken in Morse code. I could see it then, the flicker of something pass across his face. Recognition, embarrassment, or just the slow dawning that maybe he'd been talking down to the wrong man. He cleared his throat. Well, all right then. Let's get on with it. But he didn't say sorry. Didn't say my name again either. Took my seat next to Ms. Rubin, who gave me a look. Not pity, not pride, just a knowing nod. We'd only just started, but I already knew. This courtroom had memory, and I had mine. I didn't hear anything she said for the first few minutes. Ms. Rubin's voice cut clean across the courtroom, laying out precedent and due process like it was written in gospel. But my ears were still ringing with that one word. Boy, it had a way of clinging to your skin. Not the syllables, the intent. Like he'd seen my face, my frame, and made a choice. The interns on the other side, all khakis and pastel polos, kept sneaking glances at me like I was a glitch in the system. Like I had wandered into their private rehearsal and started quoting scripture. One of them leaned down to whisper, but I caught it anyway. He should be lucky he even got to speak. Lucky. I gripped my pen. This wasn't new. First year at Howard Law, I shadowed a judge in D.C. who made me wait in the hallway with the mailman, said interns needed badges, but didn't ask the white girl with the Starbucks cup a single question. Second year, I was paired with a professor who assumed I'd be more comfortable handling cases involving urban youth. And now here, back in Virginia, the courthouse my grandfather once walked through with no air conditioning, a colored-only bathroom, and a conviction rate like a loaded dice game. Full circle. Only difference was, I had his voice with me now, Ms. Reuben nudged my folder. "You ready?" I blinked. "Yes, ma'am." I rose, slid out from behind the table, and walked to the podium. Slowly, deliberately, like Granddad did. Judge Halbrook didn't look up at first. I cleared my throat once, not loud. "Your Honor, regarding the motion to suppress the search conducted on March 12th was done without a signed warrant, and no exigent circumstances were present. The officers claimed implied consent, but the body cam shows no such thing." He finally looked at me, and something changed in his posture. Not a lot, but enough. I saw the way his fingers tapped slower, the way his eyes lingered longer. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't hearing me speak. Maybe he was hearing the echo of someone else. "My client," I said, "is a teenager who made no verbal consent. He was surrounded by 3 adults in uniform, with hands on their belts. That is not a conversation, that's coercion." Silence. I laid the printed frame from the body cam on the exhibit table, a still image. My client's face blurred with fear. 3 grown men around him, no warrant in sight. This is not justice. This is pressure, and if this court honors the Fourth Amendment, it will rule accordingly. I stepped back. I hadn't raised my voice, but it still landed like thunder. When we sat back down, Ms. Reuben just whispered, "That sounded familiar." I nodded. "It should. It was my grandfather's closing in 71, word for word." She smiled, almost imperceptibly. "Judge." Halbrook adjusted his glasses, then glanced down at his notes, but his hand wasn't writing, he was just sitting with it. And for the first time that day, I think he really saw me. Lunch break was a blur. The courtroom recessed and the lobby filled with murmurs and footsteps, heels clicking, clipboards shuffling. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. It wasn't nerves, not anymore. It was memory. My grandfather's courtroom notes had margins filled with things that didn't belong to the law. Prayers, songs, little sketches of birds. He always said, "You can't take justice into a place that don't breathe. So you bring your own." That's what I did today. And yet somehow I still felt like a shadow in someone else's light. I was eating a vending machine sandwich outside on the courthouse steps when one of the interns and the one who called me lucky walked by. Thin smile, collared shirt with his firm's logo stitched near the chest like it meant something ancient. He paused, then said, "Didn't expect you to go full Johnny Cochran in there." I didn't look up. "Didn't expect you to still be following me." He chuckled like I was a puppy who got feisty. "Nah, man, props, seriously, you had a moment. People noticed, the judge didn't throw anything. That's a win, right?" I let the silence settle. Then I asked quietly, "What law school you at again?" "Georgetown." I nodded. "Then you should know better than to speak on a case you haven't read." He blinked. "Didn't like that. I was just giving you credit. Wasn't yours to give." He scoffed, shook his head, and walked off, muttering. I took another bite of the sandwich. Cold, dry. Didn't matter. I'd already tasted something deeper in that courtroom. Something rooted. Something earned. Back inside, court resumed. The judge seemed unsettled. Not angry, not hostile. Just off rhythm. Like the center of gravity had shifted, and he was trying to find his footing again. I liked that. Ms. Reuben leaned in toward me, at the table. "You're shaking the room without even raising your voice," she said under her breath. "I learned from the best," I whispered back. She didn't ask who. She already knew. When we called the next witness, a local officer who swore my client had nodded yes to the search, I noticed Judge Halbrook squinting at the man like something wasn't quite adding up. I laid out the transcript, time-stamped the footage, lined it all up. The nod never happened. I spoke slow, measured, like Granddad used to, building the truth one fact at a time like bricks in a wall. By the time I was done, the prosecutor looked nervous, the officer looked sweaty, and the judge just said, Motion. Taken under advisement. But in his voice I heard something new. Care. After the session ended, I lingered in the back while Ms. Rubin gathered her notes. A woman in a navy skirt suit approached, probably late 40s, braids pinned in a bun, no nonsense in her walk. "You're Henderson's grandson, aren't you?" I stood straight. "Yes, ma'am." She smiled gently. "I clerked here in 1993. Your grandfather taught me how to stand tall even when the room won't look you in the eye. Heard his voice in you today." "Thank you." "No," she said, her eyes firm. "Thank you. We don't get many echoes in here that still sound that strong." I walked out of that courthouse not with pride, but with purpose. They still hadn't said my name, but they would. Not just because I earned it, because I inherited it, and sharpened it, and I wasn't done speaking yet. The next morning I ironed my shirt twice. Wasn't about vanity, it was armor. Crisp edges, collar sharp, black tie centered, no stain, no wrinkle, no excuse. Because the second you let them think you're soft, they treat you like you deserve. The bruises. Outside the sky was low and grey, the kind of Virginia morning that smelled like wet soil and broken promises. Mama called while I was tying my shoes. "You sleep okay?" she asked. "Didn't sleep much." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Your grandfather didn't either, not during that case in 71, not when they slashed his tires, not when they searched his briefcase by mistake." I sat on the edge of the bed. "Why'd he keep going?" "You think he had a choice," she said softly. "He had a son to raise, a city to protect, and a last name they were trying to bury." I closed my eyes, tied the final knot. "I'll call you when it's over." Court was fuller that day, not packed but eyes were watching, not just mine. Ms. Rubin slid a fresh set of documents toward me at the table. "New motion," she whispered. "We're pushing to strike the officer's testimony entirely. Based on the inconsistency from the cam footage. And this," she tapped the paper. "Turns out Officer Draper has a history of searching minors without proper protocol. It just never made it past internal review." I looked at the file. Then up at Judge Halbrook. His face was stone, but his pen was tapping again, steady this time. When we approached the bench, it was Ms. Rubin who started, but halfway through she stepped back. "Mr. Henderson," she said. "Care to finish?" I blinked. "Are you sure?" "I'm not." She smiled. "But I trust you." I stepped forward. My shoes didn't echo like they did yesterday. The floor remembered me now. "Your Honor," I said, "we are not just asking the court to consider the facts. We're asking it to confront a pattern." I held up the internal complaint records. This isn't about one nod, or one search, or one frightened teenager. It's about the ease with which some officers violate rights and then count on silence to cover the rest. The courtroom was still. The bailiff didn't shift. The clerk didn't scribble. "This courtroom," I continued, "once heard my grandfather argue that a child has a right to attend school in peace. Today I'm asking you to recognize that same child, now handcuffed, silenced, and treated like a threat, has a right to be protected by the Constitution." My voice didn't shake. Not once. Judge Halbrook stared at me for a long while, long enough to make folks uncomfortable. Then he leaned forward, elbows to the desk. "What did you say your grandfather's name was?" "Jeremiah Nathaniel Henderson. He—" nodded slowly. "I remember. Of course he did. I clerked for my father back then," he muttered. "Your grandfather made quite the impression." I didn't speak, didn't need to. "Motion to strike the testimony is granted," he said. Gasps. A sharp breath from the prosecution. Ms. Rubin gave the faintest smile, not gloating, just grounded. Then he added, "And submit that body cam footage to the record. It deserves to be seen." Outside the courthouse, a young black boy waited with his mother. Couldn't have been more than 12, tight curls, wide eyes. "Are you the lawyer from inside?" he asked. I hesitated. "I'm training to be," he nodded. Mama said, "You talked real brave." I knelt a little, gave him a fist bump. "Your name?" I asked. "Jeremiah." I smiled. The sky cracked open a little, light starting to push through the clouds. "Keep that name strong," I said. "I will." 2 days later, the prosecutor filed a motion to drop all charges. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. Once the officer's testimony was struck, once the footage played back in slow motion on that courtroom monitor, showing a black teenager surrounded, silent, never speaking, never nodding, the case unraveled like thread soaked in rain. Judge Halbrook didn't smile when he approved the dismissal. He just signed the order, clipped it to the file, and cleared his throat like he had something else to say, but swallowed it instead. And just like that, it was over. At least for the boy. We stood outside in the parking lot, wind picking up the scent of pine and hot asphalt. Ms. Rubin lit a cigarette. Her first one in 3 months, she claimed. "You changed the tone in there," she said, watching the smoke drift. "Not the verdict, the tone. That matters more than people think." I shrugged. He still never apologized. "He won't," she said flatly. "But he'll remember, that's better." I thought about that for a long time, whether memory was enough. Later that week, I went back to Mama's house. She was folding laundry in the living room, humming an old gospel melody I half remembered from Sundays, when I still wore clip-on ties and thought communion wafers were candy. She looked up. "How'd it go?" I pulled the dismissal notice from my satchel and laid it on the table. She stared at it. No celebration, no theatrics, just silence. Then she whispered, "He would have been proud." I swallowed. "He's the only reason I made it through." She sat down. "You did more than make it through." She reached under the coffee table and pulled out something wrapped in a cloth napkin, handed it to me. I unfolded it slowly. It was Granddad's old fountain pen, the one he always held in those grainy VHS tapes. The gold trim was faded, ink dried up, but it still felt alive in my palm. "Time you carried it now," she said, "not because it's yours, because it knows who you are." The next morning, I went back to the courthouse, not for a trial, not for a client, just to sit in the gallery, watch. The judge noticed me but didn't say a word. But as he exited the bench for recess, he paused, looked directly at me, not with challenge. Not with shame, with something closer to acknowledgement, like he saw a shadow of a man he once underestimated, and the future that man left behind. Outside, the wind carried dust and pollen in the air, and I watched the town move in slow rhythm. Mail trucks, kids on bikes, mothers talking through rolled-down windows, and I thought they called me boy. But that courtroom called me something else now. Not with words, but with silence and space. Space my grandfather carved with fire. Space I now stood in, not as his echo, but as his answer. A week later, the email arrived from the clerk's office. Subject: Historical Archive Request Fulfilled. Henderson. Jay and I clicked fast, heart tight in my chest. They'd found it, a copy of my grandfather's original 1971 desegregation hearing. Full court transcript, annotated margins. Even the judge's handwritten objections scrawled in the sides like irritation in ink. I printed every page. 37 years before I was born, Jeremiah Nathaniel Henderson stood at the very same podium I had. Same courtroom, same benches. Probably the same water stain on the north wall. But unlike me, nobody stood behind him. Not a partner, not a mentor, not even the clerk, who reportedly turned his back halfway through. And yet, he'd kept speaking. That night, I spread the papers across my bedroom floor, pages curling at the edges from the heat of the lamp. I traced his closing statement with my fingertip, mouthing each line like scripture. They may not hear us today. They may not look us in the eye tomorrow, but they will feel our footsteps in this house, and one day they'll know who laid the stone. I sat back, not crying, not smiling, just quiet, like something was finally settling into place. The next morning, I showed up early for our internship group meeting at the local university legal center. Mostly white interns, a few Latinx, one other black student, a second-year girl from Spelman named Jada, who'd already told me she was just here for the hours and the free bagels. The supervising partner, Mr. Carver, adjusted his glasses and tapped the board. "I wanted to highlight something from last week's proceedings," he said. "The Henderson-Rubin case. Many of you observed, but few of you learned." He turned to me. "Mr. Henderson, you handled that suppression hearing with more poise than most associates I've trained." The room shifted. I felt it. The uncomfortable rustle of ego, the tight smiles, the shallow claps. Someone coughed. Another whispered something about overcompensating. I didn't flinch. Carver wasn't done. "More importantly," he said, "you didn't just win legally. You restored dignity. That's a different kind of justice." I nodded, careful not to smile too much. After the session, Jada caught up with me by the vending machine. "You know what they're saying, right?" she asked. "Which part?" "That. You played the grandson of a legend card. That you were theatrical." I nodded. "Heard worse." "But you weren't," she said, eyes locked on mine. "That's what's messing with them." I raised a brow. "What do you mean?" "They can handle loud," she said. "They can handle angry. But measured, smart, strategic, that's what scares them. You didn't shout. You spoke. And they heard. That's legacy. That's threat." I exhaled. "You think I changed anything?" She shrugged. "Maybe not the system, but definitely the room." That night I sat at my desk and opened the pen. Granddad's pen. The nib was still good, still held ink when I dipped it. I wrote one sentence on a blank sheet. They called me boy, but I answered as a man carved from louder silence. I folded it, slipped it into the inside of my case file folder, where no one else would ever see it, but I'd know it was there, just like him. The courthouse lobby had a chill that morning, not from the air but the eyes. A new judge was sitting in for traffic cases and misdemeanor arraignments. Younger, corporate polished, sharp suit, no smile. The kind of man who led with paperwork and followed with tone. I wasn't even scheduled to speak, but things don't always go by schedule in rooms built to misplace us. My client was 17, black, quiet, scared enough to keep his shoulders curved inward even as he sat. His mother had to work a double shift and couldn't be there. His public defender had sent an assistant who hadn't even read the full docket, and the judge, Judge Laramie, was already impatient. "This charge is minor, but the history isn't," he said, flipping through the sheet. 2 prior citations: disruptive behavior in school, loitering, trespassing, and now vandalism. Graffiti on public property. He looked at the assistant. "Are you suggesting probation?" The assistant shrugged. "That's what's listed." Judge Laramie didn't like that. He leaned forward. "This boy doesn't need probation, he needs correction. A month in detention would teach him more than coddling ever will." My hand moved on its own. I stood. "Your Honor, if I may—" The judge looked up, surprised. "You are?" "Malik Henderson, legal intern under Ms. Rubin. I reviewed this case file personally yesterday while assisting with court prep." He raised an eyebrow. "You're not licensed?" "No, sir, but I'm authorized to speak under counsel supervision, and Ms. Rubin is present in the gallery." She gave the faintest nod from the back row. No smile, just presence. I stepped forward. "I'd like to clarify a few things," I said. Judge Laramie leaned back, skeptical. "Proceed." "First, the 2 prior citations were dismissed. No formal charges. Second, The so-called vandalism was a chalk drawing, not spray paint, not property damage, a chalk drawing on a sidewalk that read, "I miss my brother." The courtroom went still. I pressed on. His brother was killed by a stray bullet last year outside their apartment building. No arrests were made. The boy drew that message under the same streetlight where it happened. The judge stared at me, unmoving. I didn't blink. "Does that sound like delinquency to you, sir?" I asked. "Or grief?" It was the quiet that told me I'd hit something. Not a victory, a nerve. The judge finally looked down at the docket again, like maybe the paper would rewrite itself under pressure. "Case dismissed," he said, almost like he didn't want to hear it come from his own mouth. And just like that, the boy was free to go. Outside, he stood frozen on the steps. Holding his backpack like it was still being searched, I walked up to him, gave him a small folded note. He opened it, read it, looked up. "What's this?" "It's the name of a free art program 2 blocks from your school," I said. "They'll give you space, supplies, walls that want to be painted." He stared at the paper for a long time, then asked, "Why'd you stand up for me?" I paused, then said, "Because somebody did it for me before I was ready to do it for myself." He nodded once, like he understood, and I watched him walk off, not as a case, as a name, as a future, as proof. That voice has weight, even when it comes from an intern, especially when it carries generations with it. 3 months later, I stood at the podium again, but this time, the courtroom was packed, not for a trial, for a dedication. They had restored one of the smaller hearing rooms in the West Wing, the same one where Granddad gave his first oral argument, where he stood in a threadbare suit, arguing for a child's right to cross school district lines and sit in a building with heat, books, and dignity. Now that room had a name: Jeremiah N. Henderson Civil Rights Hearing Chamber. Ms. Rubin and I had lobbied for it quietly, backed by law students, professors, and a few retired judges who still remembered what that courtroom had tried to forget. It wasn't unanimous, it never is, but it passed. The plaque was mounted clean and brass and solid. Mama stood beside me, her hand tucked tight into mine. Her eyes were full, but steady. "This don't bring him back," she whispered. "No," I said, "but it means he never left." Judge Halbrook showed up too, not in robes, not behind a bench, just a plain grey suit and a folded program in his hand. He didn't try to speak, just nodded at me from across the aisle. Once. I nodded. Back, that was enough. I was asked to speak. I wore my grandfather's pen in my shirt pocket, took the podium. No notes, just the sound of memory humming in my chest. "I was called many things in this building," I said. "Some were meant to diminish me, some were meant to define me, but the only name that ever mattered was the one I inherited." I paused, letting it breathe. My grandfather didn't raise his voice. He raised the floor beneath him. He didn't shout for space. He carved it. And when I stood in that same courtroom, facing that same silence, I understood something. Looked out at the crowd. Students, clerks, old bailiffs with folded arms, young lawyers leaning forward. He didn't survive this place so I could blend in. He survived it so I could stand out, so I could stand up, not just for myself, but for the ones who still whisper when they should be heard. I stepped down. People clapped, some even stood, but I didn't need their applause. I had already heard the only voice that mattered. My grandfather's, clear in my head, the way it always was on that old VHS. Say it plain, say it true, and say it like your name depends on it. Outside, as people trickled out, a young law student stopped me, wide eyes, folder clutched to her chest. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," she hesitated, then asked, "How do you know when you're ready to speak?" I smiled. "You don't, but your voice does." She nodded slowly, then walked away, straight-backed, like she already had something worth saying. I stood on the courthouse steps alone for a moment, hands in. My pockets, sun warming my skin, not as a visitor, not as a boy, but as a name, as a voice, and finally, as a legacy fulfilled.